Now with the release of Shadow of the Erdtree, the Soulsborne series has a total of 8 major DLCs, not counting the boss rush update for Sekiro. That game really needed its own full-fledged DLC. I bet it would have been the best. It definitely could not have been the worst when Crown of the Ivory King exists. Not that this is a bad DLC, but I'm going to judge these mostly for 2 major things. 1. New areas, 2. New bosses. Things like enemies in said areas, new weapons, armor, lore if I'm interested in it to begin with, and other additions to the game will also be taken into consideration. It's also worth noting I got into the series at the launch of Dark Souls 3, so I can't really say how much impact the DLCs had to the entirety of the game in prior titles. But I can say level design wise, the Dark Souls 2 trilogy of DLCs are a major step up from the base game. And that's true even for Ivory King. But at the end of the day, this DLC also houses the worst area in the series, one of the worst bosses in the series, and one of the worst enemies in the series. Since the Dark Souls 2 DLCs are on the shorter side and feature a single big area, whether you enjoy them or not hinges entirely on that big area. A lot of people absolutely love Frozen Ilium Lois, and I do see some of its finer points, but personally it just doesn't do it for me. I don't want to go too in-depth about the levels and bosses in this video. You can watch my area ranking series or my boss ranking series if you want to hear more detailed explanations about what I like and don't like. So for the sake of conserving time, I'm just going to assume that you've played these DLCs and you kinda know what I'm talking about. In short, I like the level design, I like a couple of the reworked soldier enemies, and I like Arba and the titular Ivory King. I don't love either of them. Arba is a little on the simpler side with shit hitboxes, while Ivory King is all cock and no cum. That is to say, the presentation is top-notch, while the fight isn't quite my favorite. I do really like his lore though, I'll grant him that. I don't like Lodden-Zullen, Frigid Outskirts, any of the indoor sections in Ilium Lois, and the environments to me are bland as fuck, which ruins the entire idea of having to re-explore this level in order to make the final fight not a shit show. I'm supposed to remember where each previously blocked path was, but it's kinda hard to do that when all the environments blend together for me. Biggest positive this DLC brought to the game for me is the Lois Greatsword. Overall, Crown of the Ivory King is okay. A 6 out of 10 for me. Crown of the Iron King is the middle chapter of the Dark Souls 2 DLC trilogy, and quality-wise it also sits in between the 2 others. But unlike Ilium Lois, I quite like Broom Tower, despite its many shortcomings in enemy placements. The enemies themselves are pretty interesting. The Iron Warriors with lava spewing from their shoulders in turns, possessed armors with their unnatural movements, and Fume Sorcerers with their nothing personal kid move. And level design here is on fire! It's one of the most complex structures FromSoft has created, and piecing together how it works is really fun. Negatives are again enemy placements. They're even worse than in Ivory King. I don't know what they were smoking. Must be why it's called Broom Tower. Then we have Smelter Wedges strangely punishing you for using them prior to Fume Night, and the entire Iron Passage is a worthless piece of shit area. As is its boss, but I know Blue Smelter Demon has its fans. I am not one of them. But the other 2 bosses kinda make up for it, because both Fume Knight and Zerlon are easily the best fights in the whole game. Not saying much, I know, but they still lurk around the top 20-ish to 25-ish favorite fights in the whole series for me. They're as good as Dark Souls 2's combat could possibly allow them to be. This DLC is frustrating, annoying, satisfying, and has the game's highest highs. 2 excellent bosses and a major area with its ups and downs. I'd say it's pretty good. 7 out of 10. I remember very well how disappointed people were for Ashes of Ariandel's lack of content in relation to its cost. Even the Dark Souls 2 DLCs always had 3 new bosses, even if one of them always sucked dick and was lazily put together. But in this we get 1 real boss, and the other is that one dick-sucking lazy boss. Not only that, but we only get a single new area, Ariandel. So it's more like a slightly smaller Dark Souls 2 DLC. This too will hinge entirely on its 1 new zone, and I know that's where a lot of people have diverging thoughts. It's ganky, nasty, and uninviting, but I kinda love it. My biggest issue is just Dark Souls 3's continuation of "Remember Dark Souls?" Say what you will about the whole Shards of Madness nonsense, at least all the Dark Souls 2 DLC areas were completely unique. But compared to Dark Souls 2, Ashes of Ariandel handles ganks way better. The new hollows work well in groups. The wolves aren't my favorite, but at least they're designed to circle around you and not attack all at once. And the Millwood Knights are some of my favorite enemies in the series, and I appreciate how varied the level is, both visually and in its encounters. Beautiful woods, beautiful glaciers, beautiful floating wolves, and then some less beautiful other areas. And throughout it all, it does have pretty nice atmosphere, even if it isn't wholly unique. Another big selling point, for some maybe the only selling point, is Sister Frida. While again we only get one proper boss, she does feel like 2 or 3 bosses jammed into one. I think she's wonderful, but if you don't like her, there's not much else for you to enjoy since the other boss is barely a boss. I do kind of like the wolf though. Maybe if you're into PvP, the new matchmaking arena will make up for it. Personally, it was never my thing, so it didn't change the fact that I was a little disappointed in the lack of new content. But the new content that is there is pretty damn good. So 7 out of 10 again, but since I find there are less bullshit parts to worry about, I do prefer it over Iron King. Once again, with the quality of these smaller DLCs depending mostly on the one large new zone, it should come as no surprise that Sunken Crown ranks the highest of them. Because I really like Sholva, the Sunken City. It's uncharacteristically aesthetically pleasing for Dark Souls 2 standards. It evokes a sense of wonderment, dread, and makes you feel like a grand adventurer discovering a lost civilization. You'll also discover some gankiness, not the good kind, some less than stellar sections, and of course, one god-awful side area, Cave of the Dead. Some people excuse this, Iron Passage, and Frigid Outskirts as being meant for co-op, but I never found summoning made them a whole lot better. Not at all, really. And it's certainly not worth going through for the boss waiting at the end of it, in any of them. Especially this with the abysmal gank squad. In fact, the bosses in general are the weakest aspect of this DLC for me. I kind of like Elana, I know many don't, but I think she's one of the few good gank fights in this game. And I also kind of like Sin, as long as he doesn't keep flying around too much. But neither is on the level of Zoralan or Fume Knight, and definitely not Sister Frida. Also, out of all the DLCs so far, this one has the weakest enemy roster in my opinion. They're not bad, but none stand out as particularly fun, with the exception of the Sanctum Knights. I like them. All 3 of these Dark Souls 2 DLCs also have an uber cancer invader, but for some reason Chester Thomas never attacks me, so I love him. As an overall experience, Crown of the Sunken King is by far the most consistently enjoyable of the 3 crowns, and I even like the story behind the city's destruction and abandonment. So 1 top tier large area, 1 terrible side area, and 2 decent enough bosses, and 1 that's absolutely atrocious. I'll give this one a 7.5 out of 10. I gotta leave room for the scoring of the top 4. Instead of just 1 big zone and 1 or 2 terrible side areas, Artorias of the Abyss features 3 levels and 4 bosses. I think Dark Souls 1 is more remembered for its level and world design, more so than its bosses. But this DLC flips that around because I have nothing but good to say about the major fights, and not that much about the levels. Royal Woods, the reworked Darkroot Garden, is decent. There's pretty fun enemies, but I'm not that into its flat white forest design with enemies sprinkled everywhere. The little bit of abyssal corruption does add neat atmosphere, which gets heavier and heavier as you progress the DLC. And in contrast to the woods, Ulasil Township is very linear with not much to explore. Dark Chasm of the Abyss is less linear, but still not an explorer's wet dream. I do like the overall layout of Ulasil and how the Chasm of the Abyss is directly above Royal Woods and connects to it. Atmosphere and story is all A+ material, but I do think combat-wise, exploration-wise, it's very average. I don't get a kick out of killing these spider apes, but that building tension throughout the journey is great. While the bosses to me don't really stand a chance being compared to FromSoft's newer, flashier fights, they pretty much shit on all of the base game of Dark Souls, with the exception of Ornstein and Smough. You get your fast-paced action with a beast boss in the intro, a methodical, evenly matched duel against a knight-type boss, knighthood's greatest calling that is, dragon slaying, and Manus, who is like a humanoid, beast, and spellcaster boss all in one. I like all of them quite a lot, Artorias and Manus being the biggest standouts. I can't say how much or little this DLC impacted the game at the time of its release. Maybe it was a godsend to PvPers, which I am not one of. But I can say it makes me more willing to go through the second half of the game. With this, I have something to look forward to after Ornstein and Smough. It's a great expansion. 8 out of 10. After Ashes of Ariandel lacking content for its asking price, we get almost like an apology in the form of Ringed City, which houses 2 large areas and 3 top-tier bosses. I think pretty much everyone in the world can agree that Demon Prince, Dark Eater Midir, and definitely Slave Knight Gale are all at the very least good. In my opinion, they're S-tier bosses. The new areas, however, are a little more divisive. Well, Ringed City is, because no one ever talks or thinks about Drekheap. I think Drekheap is fine. I think with it being such a messed up ruin, it contrasts well with the reveal of the Ringed City, which at first glance looks pristine. But when you go further in, you realize the majority of the city is just a big, black swamp. There's a lot of city in the vista that we never get to explore. For those who crave that large-scale exploration, they're not gonna get it here. I've come to enjoy the area just for its diverse encounters and gimmicks. Some of them work, some of them not so much, but I appreciate that they got a little more experimental with this level. And the Ringed Knights are enough to satisfy my need for engaging combat. These are to this day the most badass, awesome knights FromSoft has ever created. And probably will ever create. I love the Ringed City. I know many won't agree, but even if you don't, at least it's pretty fast to get to some of the series' best bosses. They're a spectacle, they're grand, and their soundtracks are absolutely fantastic. They are among FromSoft's most impressive bosses. And then there's Half-Light. Regardless, this is an excellent DLC, and more than that, it's a good finale for the Dark Souls series. 9 out of 10. But oh lord, oh man, oh dude, now I have to decide between the Old Hunters and Shadow of the Erdtree. Fuck me, this is hard. Shadow of the Erdtree is no DLC. Calling it an expansion also doesn't feel quite right. It's more like a second game. And it's a brilliant game that improves a lot of the issues of the previous one. After a while I found the base game's dungeons to get a bit boring, and the reused bosses at the end of them all was a little disappointing. That's fixed. Now every dungeon felt worthwhile to me, and while both open worlds have lots of empty land, I feel the exploration is actually better in the Shadow Realm, because the layout of the map isn't just flat open fields, but it's layered. For instance, Shadowkeep. At the foot of it is Shadow Altus, but below it is Raw Base and a couple of rivers that lead to several other areas, and atop Shadowkeep is yet another layer, Ancient Ruins of Raw. And all that is in close proximity. What I'm trying to say is that the layout of the Shadow Realm is the best thing about it. I've seen many argue that the exploration is rarely worth it. Like Cerulean Coast is just empty. But to me, finding the coast was a neat moment for how tucked away it was. It was the reward. Not to mention it leads to another tucked away corner, Stone Coffin Fissure. I also think Scatter Tree fragments were a stroke of brilliance that helped with the sense of progression and incentive to explore. At this point in the game, leveling up doesn't matter much. It won't make you a whole lot more powerful, you're not gonna feel it. But the upgrade from Scatter Tree fragments is something you will feel. The exploration will inevitably lose its appeal over time if the main draw is just finding these places, and that is a small problem. But first time experience is what matters most, and on that front, it worked for me. Now it gets a little tricky to compare this to other FromSoft DLCs when it's so much bigger, but also so much more spread out. There's open world segments, caves, catacombs, ruined forges, minor legacy dungeons, and major legacy dungeons. My thoughts on the major legacy dungeons is that Shadowkeep is amazing, super well connected to its surrounding areas, and cool in its own right. Enir Ilim is great, but could have gone a little longer and could have done without the Frost Lion Knight. Fuck that guy. And Belrat is pretty good, but it could have also been a little longer. Shadow Altus is a great open world region, and Ancient Ruins of Raw is an excellent middle ground between open world and legacy dungeons. The minor legacy dungeons I have very little to say except I like Midra's Manse. It's cool. But my biggest complaint about the areas and the DLC in general is the lacking enemy variety. The new Knight type enemies are awesome, and I like the Curse Blades. But mostly you see shadow people who might as well just be air. That's how significant they are. Then there's mosquito people from Ashes of Ariandel, furnace golems that are atrocious, and a lot of familiar faces. It was especially disappointing to find Abyssal Woods and discover the great terror of that place is mostly just fucking rats. Sure, there's a few winter lanterns, but mostly rats. The variety is fine for the legacy dungeons, because there they use them in a smart way to make each encounter feel fresh. But out in the open world and some of the caves, you do feel the lack of it. I haven't mentioned new weapons much in this video so far because in most other DLCs they don't make a huge difference, but I do really appreciate the new weapon types in this one. As for the bosses, oh boy, we have again an abundance of them in comparison to any other DLC. 10, arguably 11 Remembrance boss fights,
Then again, we could arguably take it back down to 10.
plus a handful of minor bosses. Despite their large quantity, there weren't many I disliked. I don't like Senesax or the Jagged Peak Dragons, or the fucking Hippo, but most linger around C and B tiers. As far as I'm concerned, we got 6 really great bosses. Divine Beast Dancing Lion, Midril Lord of Frenzied Flame, Bale the Dread, Relana Twin Moon Knight, Mesmer the Impaler, and Radahn, Consort of Mikola. Somehow, Radahn returned. From what I've seen, the new Radahn fight is the most divisive since Millennia. Lots of people despise it, and I can see why. I like it quite a lot myself, but it's not one of my favorites. I would have liked the final boss to have been something more unique. I think this comment sums it up pretty well. I recommend pausing to read it, because I am not gonna do a full Radahn review here. If you want more of my thoughts on the bosses, I did just do a full boss ranking for this DLC, so go check that out if you want. Overall, I do think the bosses are a positive force. Main thing to praise is just how varied they are. We go from slaying a schlubby skeletal horse rider to centipede scorpion lady to a fucking sunflower. The only disappointment is that I don't think any massively exceeds the quality of the base game fights, which so far has been the trend in these DLCs. Mesmer is the only one that really stands out to me as one of the all-time greats. He's perfect in every way. Love him. And all the lore surrounding him and America. Great stuff. So this DLC has its ups and downs, but since it's so huge, it has more ups than all the other DLCs combined. But they're spread out like too little butter over too much bread. At the end of the day, preference will determine if you just love that bread so much you don't need butter over every bit of it. It is an absolutely amazing expansion, 9.5 out of 10. The Old Hunters, at least for now, remains at the top for me, because despite being 5 times smaller than Shadow of the Erdtree, in that short span it still manages to outdo it in many aspects. Sod has 1 S tier area for me, the Old Hunters has 3. Sod adds 1 more boss to my favorites of all time list, maybe 2, while the Old Hunters adds 3. The DLC opens with Hunter's Nightmare, a beautifully ugly zone with fun enemies and tons of weapons that will change how you play the game. The weapons really are an overlooked aspect of this DLC. The base game of Bloodborne suffered quite a lot from the lack of weapon variety, but with this DLC the number of weapons is fucking doubled, and they are so much fun to use. Research Hall is up there with the best designed layouts for a level, with disturbing yet kind of funny encounters.
Blip, blop.
And Fishing Hamlet, aesthetically pleasing, mechanically challenging, leads to the conclusion of the journey. The opening boss, Ludwig the Accursed, while gameplay-wise doesn't quite hold up to my other favorite fights, is still to this day the coolest boss, with the most memorable moment in the series for me. And then they follow it up with Living Failures. Okay, it's not that bad, and Lady Maria more than makes up for it. She's just pure adrenaline-fueled fun. I could fight her phase 3 for hours on end and not get bored. Lawrence the First Vicar, not one of the all-time greats, but I like it. Also, I really need to mention the music in this DLC. Ludwig, Lawrence, Living Failures, Lady Maria, some of the best tracks that they've ever put out. Often of course theme gets kinda overshadowed by them, but as a fight, this is what a final DLC boss should be. It's complex, challenging, fun, unique, and a fitting wrap-up to the story. It's not a whole new game like Shadow of the Erdtree, but it almost literally carries Bloodborne and makes it a near-perfect game. Whereas Shadow of the Erdtree doesn't make me like Elden Ring more or less. It's just more Elden Ring, and that's good, but quantity was never the issue. Bloodborne, however, needs the Old Hunters. That makes it the most important DLC. And it is consistently good, with no major dips in quality. It's a 10 out of 10 for me. Not to say it's completely without flaw, but as close to it as we're probably ever going to get. So that's my ranking, not necessarily yours. I could definitely see Shadow of the Erdtree being number 1. I myself went back and forth a lot. If just the sheer amount of content puts it over Old Hunters for you, that's completely fair. And I could still change my mind over time, you never know. But next time I might rank either the individual areas of the Shadow Realm or all the Remembrance bosses of Elden Ring. Let me know which you'd prefer. See ya.